The soft glow of 1,000 fairy lights twinkled in the lush canopy of the old oak trees, casting a magical, dappled light across the manicured lawns of my family's estate. It was a perfect early autumn evening, the air crisp and filled with the scent of late-blooming roses and expensive champagne. Laughter and the gentle murmur of conversation mingled with the sophisticated strains of a live string quartet playing near the marble fountain. Everything, absolutely everything, was perfect. It was my engagement party, a night I had dreamed of since I was a little girl playing dress-up with my mother's pearls. Tonight, I was Amelia, and the world was mine. Standing beside me, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, was Ethan. My Ethan. He looked impossibly handsome in his tailored navy suit, his dark hair catching the light, his blue eyes fixed on me with an adoration that made my heart feel like it was floating. He was everything I had ever wanted. Charming, ambitious, intelligent, and I believed utterly devoted to me. We had met in our final year of university, a whirlwind romance that had felt like something out of a classic novel. He was the driven son of a successful surgeon, and I was the heir to my father's vast property development empire. We were, as everyone so often commented, a perfect match, a power couple in the making. "Happy, my love," Ethan whispered, his breath warm against my ear. He leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to my temple. I turned my head to look at him, a genuine, all-encompassing smile spreading across my face. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," I murmured, my gaze sweeping over the scene before us. Our friends and family, the creme de la creme of our social circle, were all here. They were scattered across the lawn in elegant clusters, sipping champagne, nibbling on canapés served by uniformed staff, and admiring the opulent decorations that my mother, Victoria, had spent a small fortune on. "It's perfect, thank you for this." "I'd give you the world if you'd let me, Amelia," he said, his voice sincere. He squeezed my hand, his thumb stroking over the magnificent diamond on my ring finger. It was a 5-carat cushion cut, a bespoke piece he designed himself, and it glittered with an almost obscene fire under the party lights. It was a symbol of his love, he'd told me, a promise of the brilliant future we were going to build together. My father, Richard, caught my eye from across the lawn where he was deep in conversation with Ethan's parents. He raised his glass to me, a proud, beaming smile on his face. I smiled back, feeling a wave of warmth and gratitude wash over me. My father was my rock, my mentor, the man who had taught me everything I knew about business and life. He had always wanted the best for me, and in his eyes, Ethan was the best. He approved wholeheartedly, which meant the world to me. The only small, almost imperceptible shadow on my otherwise flawless evening was my sister, Isabella. I spotted her near the champagne tower, her crimson dress a slash of vibrant color against the sea of pastel silks and dark suits. She was laughing at something one of Ethan's groomsmen, Jacob, had said, but her eyes kept flicking over to where Ethan and I stood. There was an expression in them I couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of something that wasn't quite happiness. Isabella and I were Irish twins, born just 11 months apart, but we couldn't have been more different. I was the responsible one, the planner, the one who followed in my father's footsteps, earning my business degree and preparing to one day take over the family company. I was my father's daughter. Isabella, on the other hand, was the free spirit, the artist, the dreamer. She was beautiful, undeniably so, with our mother's fiery hair and a willowy grace that drew people to her. But she was also flighty, impulsive, and possessed a talent for drama that could exhaust a saint. She was my mother's favorite, the one who was always forgiven for her transgressions with a sigh and a fond shake of the head. While I spent my 20s building a career, Isabella had drifted. She tried art school, a disastrous foray into acting, and a short-lived career as a yoga instructor. Nothing ever stuck. She lived in a chic downtown apartment funded by a generous trust fund our father had set up for her, spending her days painting canvases that never sold and her nights charming her way through the city's most exclusive parties. There was always a quiet, simmering resentment between us. I envied her freedom, her effortless charm, and the way she never seemed to worry about the future. And she, I suspected, envied my purpose, my success, and most of all, my relationship with our father. And then, she had envied my relationship with Ethan. When I first brought him home, Isabella had been overtly flirtatious, her usual tactic with any man who entered my orbit. She had hung on his every word, touched his arm a little too often, and laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. Ethan, to his credit, had seemed politely immune, his focus remaining solely on me. But I had seen the look in Isabella's eyes when she thought no one was watching, a covetous, hungry look that made me deeply uncomfortable. I had dismissed it as typical sibling rivalry, a petty jealousy she would eventually get over. I had been so wrong. As the night wore on, the toasts began. My father gave a heartfelt speech about watching me grow into the woman I had become, his voice thick with emotion as he officially welcomed Ethan into our family. Ethan's father followed, speaking of his pride in his son and his joy at our union. My best friend and maid of honor, Chloe, shared a few funny, tearful anecdotes from our childhood. Each speech was a beautiful tribute, layering more joy and emotion onto a night that already felt heavy with it. "And now," my father announced, his voice booming slightly through the microphone, "I believe my younger daughter, Isabella, would also like to say a few words." A ripple of surprise went through me. Isabella hadn't mentioned wanting to give a speech. She hated public speaking, or at least she always claimed to. I glanced over at her. She was already making her way to the small, elevated stage, a champagne flute in her hand. She had a strange smile on her face, a look of triumphant resolve that sent a sudden, inexplicable chill down my spine. Ethan's hand tightened on mine. "I didn't know she was planning this," he murmured, his voice low. There was a nervous edge to it that I had never heard before. "It's fine," I whispered back, though a knot of apprehension was beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. "It's probably just some silly, embarrassing story she's dredged up." Isabella reached the microphone, her red dress clinging to her slender frame. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning to her. She looked out over the sea of faces, her gaze lingering for a moment on our parents, then on Ethan, and finally on me. That strange smile never left her lips. "Hello, everyone," she began, her voice surprisingly steady and clear. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Isabella, Amelia's younger sister." She paused, taking a slow sip of her champagne. The silence stretched, becoming taut and heavy. "We're all here tonight to celebrate a union. A perfect union between two perfect people with a perfect future ahead of them." Her tone was syrupy sweet, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something sharp and bitter. I felt Ethan shift uncomfortably beside me. "Amelia has always been the golden child," Isabella continued, her eyes locking onto mine. "She gets everything she wants. The best grades, daddy's approval, the corner office, and of course, the perfect man." She gestured with her flute towards Ethan. "And I've always been so happy for her, watching her get all the things she deserves." The word deserves was laced with a sarcasm so thick it was almost suffocating. The guests started to murmur, a confused, uneasy energy beginning to ripple through the crowd. My mother was frowning, a look of concern on her face. My father looked utterly bewildered. "But sometimes," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a more conspiratorial level, "life isn't about deserving. It's not about plans or timelines or who is supposed to be with whom. Sometimes it's just about love, a love that's so powerful and so real and so passionate that it just happens. It doesn't care about rules or promises or even a 5-carat diamond ring." My blood ran cold. The knot in my stomach tightened into a ball of ice. I stared at her, my mind refusing to process the direction this was heading. I could feel the blood draining from my face. Beside me, Ethan was rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped my hand. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at Isabella, his expression a mask of pure panic. Isabella took a deep breath, placing a hand deliberately, theatrically, on her flat stomach. The ruby on her finger, a family heirloom, glittered malevolently. "See, I believe in that kind of love. The kind of love that creates life," she declared, her voice ringing out across the stunned silence of the lawn. "I believe that Ethan and I deserve to be happy. We deserve to celebrate our love and our future family." She finally tore her gaze from mine and looked directly at Ethan, her eyes softening with a look of mock tenderness that was nauseatingly performative. "And that's why I'm so thrilled to announce, on this very special night," she said, her voice rising to a crescendo, ensuring every single one of our 300 guests could hear her clearly, "that I'm pregnant, and Ethan is the father." the world didn't so much as shatter as it did freeze. For a single, eternal second, the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. The string quartet faltered, a single violin screeching a discordant note before falling silent. The gentle murmur of conversation died in 300 throats at once. Even the autumn breeze seemed to still, the fairy lights flickering in a sudden, oppressive silence. The only sound was the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart against my ribs, a wild drumbeat in a soundless void. Isabella stood on that stage, bathed in the soft glow of the spotlights, her hand still resting on her stomach. She looked like a twisted Madonna, a portrait of smug, triumphant malice disguised as maternal bliss. Her eyes, glittering with unshed tears of manufactured emotion, were locked on Ethan. And Ethan was a statue carved from cowardice. His face was ashen, his mouth slightly agape. The hand that had been holding mine so tenderly moments before had gone limp and clammy. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on my sister, trapped in the headlights of the destruction they had wrought together. Then the freeze broke. It started as a whisper, a collective gasp that rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Phones were subtly raised, recording the most spectacular social implosion of the decade. Faces turned, a sea of morbid curiosity and pity all directed at me. I was the centerpiece of the disaster, the jilted bride-to-be, the pathetic fool who hadn't seen the viper in her own house, the traitor in her own bed. The humiliation was a physical force, a hot, searing wave that washed over me, threatening to buckle my knees. My father was the first to move. I saw him from the corner of my eye, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief and rage. He shoved his way through a cluster of stunned business associates, his progress a wake of dropped canapes and jostled champagne flutes. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, his voice echoing across the now-dead lawn. It was his CEO voice, the one that made grown men tremble in the boardroom. "Isabella, get down from there this instant." My mother, Victoria, looked like she was about to faint. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She was looking back and forth between Isabella on the stage and me, as if trying to decide which daughter's catastrophe required her immediate attention. But Isabella didn't move. She merely tilted her chin up, defiant. "It's the truth, Daddy," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine righteousness. "I'm sorry it had to come out this way, but Ethan and I were in love. We couldn't live a lie any longer. We deserve to be happy." We deserve to be happy. The words slammed into me, knocking the air from my lungs, the sheer, unmitigated gall of it. They had destroyed my happiness, my future, my trust, and they had done it in the most public, cruel way imaginable, and they were framing it as some noble quest for their own joy. That's when the rage began to stir. It was a cold, dark thing, uncoiling in the pit of my stomach where the icy knot of shock had been. It started to burn away the humiliation, replacing it with a terrifying, clarifying focus. I finally pulled my hand from Ethan. He flinched, as if burned, and finally, he looked at me. His blue eyes, the ones I had thought held a universe of love for me, were filled with a pathetic cocktail of guilt and fear. "Amelia," he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. I was going to tell you, I swear, I didn't know how." "You didn't know how?" My voice came out low and steady, a stranger's voice. It was unnervingly calm. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on us, watching this intimate, brutal exchange. "So you let my sister announce her pregnancy with your child at our engagement party. That was the best method you could come up with." Before he could stammer out another pathetic excuse, my father reached us. He grabbed Ethan by the arm, his grip like steel. "You," he snarled, his face inches from Ethan. "You will leave my property, now." He then turned his furious gaze on Ethan's parents, who were standing nearby, looking utterly mortified. "And you can take your parasite of a son with you." The party was over. There was no grand announcement, just a quiet, frantic exodus. Guests began to melt away into the darkness, murmuring apologies, their faces a mixture of sympathy and a barely concealed thrill at having witnessed such a scandal. The staff, professionals to the end, began clearing glasses with averted eyes. The string quartet packed their instruments with a speed that suggested they were fleeing a burning building. The magical night had curdled into a sordid, public spectacle. My mother finally found her feet and rushed towards the stage, her voice a frantic hiss. "Isabella, what have you done? What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I'm tired of living in Amelia's shadow," Isabella shot back, descending the small steps, her dramatic performance over. "I'm tired of her getting everything while I get nothing. I love him, Mother, and he loves me. Is that so wrong?" I watched them, a detached observer of my own life's demolition. My father was practically dragging Ethan towards the grand entryway of the house, ignoring the pleas and apologies tumbling from Ethan's mouth. The world had narrowed to this one hideous scene. My sister, defiant and pregnant. My ex-fiancé, a sniveling coward. My father, consumed by rage. And my mother, wringing her hands in distress. And me, standing in the center of the wreckage, my custom-made silk dress suddenly feeling like a costume for a tragedy. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I walked with a measured, deliberate pace, my back straight, my head held high. I walked past the wilting flower arrangements, the half-eaten cake, the abandoned glasses of champagne that had been meant to toast my future. I walked into the house, through the grand marble foyer, and up the sweeping staircase to my childhood bedroom, ignoring the frantic calls of my mother behind me. I closed the heavy oak door and leaned against it, and only then did the facade crack. A single, silent tear traced a path down my cheek. Then another. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the plush carpet, my arms wrapped around my knees. The cold, hard diamond of my engagement ring pressed into my skin. With a surge of revulsion, I tore it from my finger and hurled it across the room. It hit the far wall with a small, unsatisfying clink and disappeared into the deep pile of the rug. The pain was immense, a physical ache in my chest so profound I thought my heart might actually be breaking. It wasn't just the loss of Ethan. It was the loss of the future I had so meticulously planned. The marriage, the children, the partnership, both personal and professional. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed fantasy. And the betrayal of my sister, that was a deeper, more venomous wound. This wasn't a simple mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated act of war. She had chosen my happiest moment to deliver her cruelest blow. She had waited, she had planned, she had savored the thought of my public humiliation. She hadn't just stolen my fiancé, she had tried to steal my dignity, my standing, my very identity as the daughter who had it all. I let myself feel it all for a few minutes. The grief, the rage, the soul-crushing humiliation. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen. I let the storm break over me, a hurricane of emotion that left me hollowed out and shaking on the floor of my bedroom. And then, in the ensuing quiet, a new thought began to form. It started as a whisper, a flicker of memory from years ago. A slammed door. My parents' raised voices, muffled but angry from my father's study. I had been a teenager, creeping down the hall to get a glass of water late one night. I had paused outside the door, my curiosity piqued. "I don't care what the circumstances were, Victoria," my father's voice had roared. "A promise is a promise. My name, my protection, that was the deal. But she will never have a legal claim. The trust is ironclad. It is for my bloodline and my bloodline only." "She is my daughter, Richard," my mother had sobbed back. "How can you be so cruel?" "She is your daughter, yes," my father had replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "But she is not mine, and that is a truth we will all take to our graves for her sake." At the time, the words had been confusing, terrifying. I had dismissed them as part of some abstract argument, a fight about money and family legacy that I didn't understand. I had buried the memory, pretended I'd never heard it. It was too ugly, too destabilizing. But now, sitting on the floor amidst the ruins of my life, the memory resurfaced with stunning, brutal clarity. She is your daughter, but she is not mine. My father, Richard, was not Isabella's biological father. The implications of this secret, a secret I was certain Isabella herself didn't know, hit me with the force of a physical blow. Our entire family was built on a foundation of intricate legal documents, trusts, and inheritance clauses all designed to protect the family empire and pass it down through the bloodline. My father was obsessed with legacy. He had built his company from the ground up, and his name, his blood, was everything to him. He had raised Isabella as his own, given her his name, showered her with affection and money. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the legal framework of our family's fortune would reflect the cold, hard truth he had spoken that night. Isabella thought she had won. She thought she had secured her future by latching onto Ethan, by getting pregnant, by staking her claim in the most dramatic way possible. She believed her position in the family was unassailable, that her trust fund and future inheritance were her birthright. She had wielded her pregnancy as a weapon to destroy me. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. My tears had dried. The grief was still there, a hard lump of coal in my chest, but the rage had been transmuted into something else. Something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. Isabella had started this war with a public toast, meant to ruin me. It was only fitting that I end it with one of my own. She thought she knew how to play the game, but she had no idea of the secrets I held. She had just handed me the gun, the bullets, and the perfect motive. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to pull the trigger. I awoke to the gray, unforgiving light of dawn. For a moment, a blissful, ignorant moment I didn't remember. I stretched my limbs, the familiar comfort of my silk sheets a soft cocoon. Then it all came crashing back. The music stopping, the gasps, Isabella's triumphant face, Ethan's crumbling one. The memory was a physical blow, winding me, leaving me breathless in the morning quiet. The beautiful dream had become a grotesque nightmare, and I was now fully, terribly awake. I pushed myself out of bed, my body aching as if I'd been in a fight. I padded across the room and retrieved the engagement ring from the depths of the rug where it had lain all night. It felt alien in my palm, a cold, heavy piece of a life that no longer existed. It was no longer a symbol of love. It was the shrapnel from an explosion. I walked into my ensuite bathroom, opened the lid of the toilet, and dropped it in. I watched it sink, its fire extinguished in the porcelain bowl, and then I flushed. The sound was a definitive, satisfying roar, the first act of purging the poison from my system. I showered in scalding water, scrubbing my skin raw, trying to wash away the phantom feeling of Ethan's touch, the stain of his betrayal. When I looked in the mirror, the woman staring back was a stranger. Her eyes, usually warm and bright, were shadowed and hard, chips of ice. The soft lines of her face seemed to have sharpened overnight. There was no trace of the happy, trusting Amelia from the party. This was someone new, someone forged in the fires of humiliation and rage. I didn't mourn the loss of the old me. I welcomed her replacement. She was a survivor. She was a warrior. I bypassed the closets filled with soft cashmere and elegant dresses and chose instead a black, sharply tailored pantsuit. It was my armor, the uniform I wore to the office when I needed to project an aura of untouchable authority. I styled my hair into a severe, sleek ponytail and applied my makeup with a precise, steady hand. A bold, blood-red lipstick was the final touch, a war paint. When I descended the stairs, the house was cloaked in a funereal silence. The grand foyer, which had been so full of life and laughter just 12 hours earlier, now felt cavernous and cold. The lingering scent of champagne and roses was sickly sweet, the smell of decay. I found my mother in the morning room, staring blankly into a cup of untouched tea. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of pity and apprehension. "Amelia, darling," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "How are you?" "I'm fine, Mother," I said, my voice cool and even. I walked to the espresso machine and began preparing a cup, my movements efficient and deliberate. "We need to talk about last night," she said, wringing a silk handkerchief in her hands. "About Isabella." "What is there to talk about?" I replied without turning around. She revealed herself to be a treacherous, morally bankrupt leech, and Ethan revealed himself to be a spineless, weak-willed coward. The information is noted. "Don't be so cold," she chided softly. "She's your sister. She's just impulsive. She gets these ideas in her head. She says she's in love with him. People do foolish things for love." I finally turned to face her, my espresso cup in hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip before I spoke. "Love." I let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. "Don't be naive, Mother. That wasn't about love. That was a calculated business move. Isabella saw an asset she wanted, my fiancé, my future, my status, and she staged a hostile takeover. She is a parasite, and for far too long you have been her willing host." Victoria flinched as if I had slapped her. That is a cruel thing to say. Is it crueler than what she did to me in front of 300 people? Is it crueler than sleeping with her own sister's fiancé and getting pregnant with his child? I set my cup down with a sharp clink. Your perpetual need to coddle her, to excuse her appalling behavior, is the reason she felt entitled enough to do this. You have spent her entire life shielding her from consequences. Well, I'm afraid her free ride is over. Before she could respond, my father's voice cut through the tension. Amelia is right, Victoria. He stood in the doorway, already dressed in a dark suit, his jaw tight with a barely controlled fury. He looked as if he hadn't slept at all. He walked over to me, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. His gaze was fixed on my mother. Our priority now is Amelia, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. It is protecting this family's name from the disgrace that your daughter and that pathetic boy have brought upon us. The way he said your daughter was not lost on me. It was a subtle, venomous distinction, a verbal underscoring of the secret I now clutched like a dagger. Richard, she is your daughter too, my mother whispered, her eyes filling with tears. She has a very strange way of showing her gratitude, he bit out, then turned his attention to me. His expression softened slightly. I've already spoken to the lawyers. The partnership agreements my company had with Ethan's father are being terminated. I'm calling in a few markers. By the time I'm done, he won't be able to get a job as a janitor in this city. His family will be ostracized. I felt a grim satisfaction at his words. This was the father I knew, ruthless, decisive, and fiercely protective of his own. Good, I said simply. As for Isabella, he continued, his face hardening again, she is a more complicated problem, but one we will deal with. He sighed, running a hand over his face. I have summoned her and Ethan to a meeting here tonight, 7 o'clock, in my study. It's time we put an end to this circus and establish the terms of this situation. Isabella seemed to think the meeting was a negotiation. She arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, with Ethan trailing behind her like a chastened puppy. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere dress, her hand once again resting proprietarily on her still flat stomach. She had the audacity to look serene, as if she were the wronged party, a Juliet kept from her Romeo. Ethan just looked terrified. He wouldn't meet my father's eyes or mine. I had been waiting for them in the study, sitting in one of the high-backed leather chairs opposite my father's imposing mahogany desk. My mother hovered nervously near the fireplace. My father stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the darkening grounds where my life had been dismantled less than 24 hours ago. Daddy, Isabella began, her voice soft and placating. I'm so glad we can all talk about this like adults. My father turned around slowly, and the look on his face could have frozen lava. Don't you dare call me that, he snarled. You lost the right to that name last night. Sit down, both of you. They scurried into the chairs on the other side of the desk. The silence in the room was thick and suffocating. I want to know one thing, my father said, his voice dangerously low as he took his seat behind the desk. He looked at Ethan. Was this your plan? To humiliate my daughter, to disgrace my family? No, sir, I swear, Ethan stammered, his eyes wide. Things just happened. It was a mistake. I never meant to hurt Amelia. He glanced at Isabella, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. I love Isabella. I want to do the right thing by her, by our child. The right thing? I spoke for the first time, my voice slicing through his pathetic excuse. The right thing would have been to have a shred of decency, a modicum of character. The right thing would have been to tell me before you let my sister detonate a bomb in the middle of my life. I'm sorry, Amelia, Isabella said, her voice laced with false sympathy. I truly am, for the timing, but our feelings are real. All we want is for this family to accept it and for us to move forward. She looked at my father. The baby will be your first grandchild, after all. We need to think of the baby. Ah, there it was, her trump card. The grandchild, the heir, the unbreakable link to the family and its fortune. She thought it made her untouchable. She was playing checkers while I was playing chess. My father stared at her, his expression unreadable. The baby, he repeated flatly. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a single, thick document bound in blue. He slid it across the polished surface of the desk. "This is a copy of your trust, Isabella, the one I established for you on your 18th birthday." Isabella frowned, confused. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Read paragraph 4, section B," my father said, his voice like ice. "The morality clause." Isabella picked up the document, her brow furrowed. Ethan leaned over her shoulder to read. I knew the clause by heart. I had a similar one in my own trust. It stipulated that any beneficiary who brought public disrepute, scandal, or disgrace upon the family name would have their access to the funds immediately and irrevocably terminated, pending a review by the family patriarch. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious. You would cut me off over this. I'm pregnant with your grandchild." And that's when I saw my opening. It was perfect. She had laid the foundation, handed me the microphone. It was time for my toast. I stood up slowly, a predator that had been waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. All eyes turned to me. I picked up the crystal glass of water from the small table beside my chair, holding it aloft as if it were the finest champagne. "A grandchild," I said, my voice ringing with a chilling clarity in the silent room. I looked at Isabella, at her smug, defiant face, and I smiled. It was not a nice smile. "You keep using that word, sister, and I think it's time we all had a little chat about genetics, about legacy, and about what it truly means to be a part of this family's bloodline." I held her gaze, letting the moment stretch, letting the fear begin to dawn in her eyes. "So, by all means, let's make a toast. To the baby. And to its real grandfather." The air in the study grew thin, supercharged with a silence that was louder than any scream. My words hung between us, a glittering, poisoned chalice offered to the room. I held my water glass steady, my hand as calm as a surgeon. Inside, however, my heart hammered a frantic rhythm, a counterpoint to the glacial composure I projected. This was the point of no return. The bridges were not just burning, they were being vaporized. Isabella was the first to break. A short, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "What on earth are you talking about, Amelia? Have you gone completely insane? The real grandfather." She turned to our father, her expression one of theatrical concern for my sanity. "Daddy, I think the stress has been too much for her. She's delusional." Ethan, ever the follower, nodded in vigorous agreement, his face a mask of confusion. "Amelia, this is a low blow, even for you. You're just trying to hurt her." But my mother's reaction was the one that told the real story. All color drained from her face, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. Her hand flew to her throat, and a small, strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her eyes, wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, darted from me to Richard. It was a look of pure, primal fear, the look of a cornered animal who knows the trap has finally sprung. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was a confession, screaming across the room. My father, Richard, remained impassive. He simply steepled his fingers on the polished desk, his gaze moving from my mother's terrified face to mine. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a deep, weary resignation and a flicker of something that might have been grim approval. He knew. Of course he knew. He had always known. "She's not delusional," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He was no longer a father in this room. He was a judge about to pass sentence. He looked at my mother. "The truth has a way of coming out, Victoria. Perhaps, after all these years of lies, you should be the one to explain." My mother swayed on her feet, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. She clutched the marble mantelpiece for support, her knuckles white. "Richard, please," she whispered, her voice a ragged plea. "Not like this." Isabella's smug defiance began to crumble, replaced by a creeping dread. She looked from our father's granite expression to our mother's utter devastation. "Explain what?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Mother, what is he talking about? What is this lunatic rambling about?" I took a slow step forward, drawing the focus back to me. "He's talking about the night I overheard you two fighting, years ago," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "I was 16. You were in this very study, screaming at each other. Do you remember, Mother? You were sobbing, and Father was telling you that while he had given Isabella his name and his protection, she would never have a true legal claim because she was not of his blood." I let the words settle. watching as the memory seemed to dawn on my mother's horrified face. "You see, Isabella," I continued, my voice calm and pedagogical, as if explaining a simple business concept. "Our father is a meticulous man. He builds empires on solid foundations. He leaves nothing to chance. And blood, to a man like him, is the most solid foundation of all. It's the one thing that can't be forged or faked or bought. It is legacy. It is everything." "You're lying," Isabella shrieked, jumping to her feet. The chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. "This is a sick, twisted lie you've invented because you're jealous. You've always been jealous of me. Daddy, tell her she's a liar." She looked at Richard, her eyes wide and pleading, waiting for the familiar reassurance, the paternal protection that had always been her right. But it didn't come. Richard just stared back at her, his face a cold, unmoving mask. In his silence, Isabella found her answer. The fight seemed to drain out of her in an instant. Her shoulders slumped. Her face, which had been contorted with rage, went slack with dawning horror. She turned a slow, bewildered gaze to our mother. "Mother," she whispered, the single word trembling with a child's terror. Is it true?" Victoria finally broke. A great, shuddering sob tore through her, and she covered her face with her hands. "I am so sorry, my baby," she wept into her palms. "I am so sorry. I never wanted you to find out. I never wanted to hurt you." And there it was, the confirmation, the final nail in the coffin of Isabella's life as she knew it. Ethan looked like he had been poleaxed. He stared at Isabella, then at my mother, then at my father, his mind visibly struggling to process the cataclysmic shift that had just occurred. He hadn't just cheated with his fiancée's sister. He had cheated with a lie. He had traded the heiress of a multi-billion-dollar empire for who, exactly? The illegitimate daughter of some unknown man. The sheer, catastrophic stupidity of his own actions seemed to be dawning on him, and his face turned a pasty, sickly green. Isabella stood frozen for a long moment, swaying slightly, as if the very ground beneath her feet had turned to quicksand. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely audible, a ghost of a sound. "If he's not my father, who is?" My mother couldn't speak, her grief was too overwhelming. So my father answered for her, his voice clipped and brutal, sparing no one's feelings. His name was David, your mother's art history professor from university. A brief, regrettable affair during a time when your mother and I were separated. She came back to me, pregnant. I made a choice. I chose to raise you as my own, to give you my name, to protect you and your mother from the scandal. I have honored that choice every single day for 27 years. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, cold and assessing. I have given you a life of privilege you could never have dreamed of. And this, he gestured around the room, at the wreckage of our family, is how you repay me. Isabella flinched as if he'd struck her. The name David meant nothing to her, which was the point. He wasn't a titan of industry or a respected surgeon. He was a footnote, a nobody, which meant she was a nobody. "So the trust fund," she stammered, her mind racing, latching onto the one tangible thing she might have left. "The morality clause, that's just a threat, right? You wouldn't actually." "It is not a threat," Richard stated, his voice the final, chilling toll of a bell. "It is a legally binding contract, and the bloodline inheritance clauses are even more ironclad. They were designed for this exact purpose, to ensure that the wealth I have built, the empire that bears my name, passes only to my direct, biological descendants." He looked directly at me, to Amelia, and to her children should she have them. The finality in his voice was absolute. There was no appeal, no negotiation. The game was over. Isabella stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The reality was crashing down on her, a tsunami of loss. Her name, her identity, her father, her fortune, all stripped away in the space of 10 minutes. The baby she was carrying was no longer her trump card. It was an anchor that would drag her down into a life she was utterly unprepared for. She turned her furious, desperate gaze on me. "You," she spat, her voice thick with a venomous hatred that was almost pure. "You did this. You knew all this time, and you waited. You waited for the perfect moment to destroy me." "You destroyed yourself, Isabella," I replied, my voice calm. "You lit the match. You set the bomb. All I did was stand back and watch it detonate. You called this a quest for happiness. You said you deserved to be happy. Well, consider this a lesson in what you truly deserve. Consequences. Her eyes darted to Ethan, who was now staring at her with a look of undisguised horror and revulsion. He saw her now not as the passionate, alluring free spirit, but as a liability. A penniless, disgraced, pregnant liability. The future he had imagined with her, a comfortable life funded by her family's money, had just vanished. He was trapped. "Ethan," she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "Ethan, it doesn't matter. We have each other. We love each other. We can build our own life." Ethan just shook his head slowly, a dazed, sick look on his face. "You lied to me," he whispered. "Your whole life is a lie." "And you lied to me," I interjected coolly, looking at him. "It seems you two have that in common. A perfect match, after all." That was enough for my father. He stood up, his authority absolute. "This meeting is over," he declared. He pointed a resolute finger at the door. "Isabella, your access to all bank accounts and credit cards has been terminated as of 1 hour ago. The security at your apartment building have been instructed not to allow you entry. You will have 1 day to arrange for a moving company to collect your personal belongings, which will be supervised by my staff. You are to have no further contact with this family." "You can't do this," she sobbed. "Where will I go? What will I do? I have nothing." "You have him," Richard said, gesturing dismissively at Ethan. "You made your choice. Now live with it." He turned to Ethan. "And you? I believe I told you to get off my property last night. My offer to ensure you never work in this city again still stands. I suggest you take her and leave. Now." There was nothing left to say. Defeated, broken, and utterly ruined, Isabella allowed Ethan to take her arm and lead her from the room. She didn't look back. The sound of the heavy study door closing behind them was a definitive, resounding end. In the ringing silence, only the three of us remained: the broken king, the weeping queen, and the avenging princess. My mother was still crying softly by the fireplace. My father sank back into his chair, the rage finally draining from him, leaving behind an old, tired man. I calmly placed my water glass back on the table. The toast was complete. I had won. I had protected my position, exacted my revenge, and eliminated my rival. I had raised the battlefield until I was the only one left standing. But as I looked at the shattered figures of my parents and the gaping hole where my sister used to be, I felt no triumph, no joy, only the cold, sterile, and profoundly empty silence of a victory that had cost me everything. The silence that descended upon the study after their departure was heavier and more suffocating than the tense quiet that had preceded it. It was the silence of a tomb, the stillness of a battlefield after the last soldier has fallen. All that remained were the casualties. My mother's sobs had subsided into quiet, ragged breaths, her body still slumped against the mantelpiece as if it were the only thing holding her upright. My father, Richard, looked a decade older, the immense effort of his rage and resolve having hollowed him out, leaving behind a husk. He stared at the closed door, not in anger, but with a profound, soul-deep weariness. And me, I stood in the center of the room, the victor. I had played my hand with devastating precision, and I had won. I had stripped my enemies of everything, their love, their future, their very identities. I had protected my legacy and secured my position. Yet the adrenaline of the confrontation was already draining away, leaving behind a cold, metallic taste in my mouth like old blood. There was no elation, no thrill of triumph. There was only this vast, echoing emptiness. The silence in the room was a perfect mirror for the silence in my own heart. "Well," my father finally said, his voice raspy. He pushed himself up from his chair, his movements stiff. He walked to the ornate liquor cabinet in the corner and poured himself a generous measure of Scotch neat. He didn't offer one to my mother or me. "It is done." He downed the drink in one go, the glass clinking as he set it back down. He turned to face me, his eyes clear and assessing. "You were formidable, Amelia. You have my steel, more of it than I realized." It should have been the highest compliment he could pay me, the validation I had sought my entire life. To be seen by him not just as a daughter, but as an equal, a successor worthy of his empire. But the words felt like stones. He wasn't praising his daughter, he was acknowledging a fellow predator. The warmth that had once existed between us, the easy affection of a father for his child, had been burned away in the fire of the last 24 hours. What was left was respect, yes, but a cold respect. An alliance. We were business partners now, bound by blood and secrets and the empire we had just secured. I simply nodded, unable to speak. He then turned to my mother. "Victoria, this changes nothing between us. Our life continues as it always has, but we will never speak of her again. As of this moment, we have only one daughter." His voice was not cruel, merely factual. It was the closing of a ledger. The finalization of an account that had been left open for far too long. My mother just wept, a silent stream of tears tracing paths through her perfect makeup. She was mourning the loss of a child he had never truly considered his own. Our family, the perfect facade we presented to the world, had been built on a fault line, and the earthquake had finally come. We were left standing on separate, jagged pieces of what used to be a whole. The months that followed were a study in quiet efficiency. I threw myself into my work at the company with a singular, ferocious focus. I worked 18-hour days, my grief and anger channeled into spreadsheets, negotiations, and acquisitions. I was brilliant. I was ruthless. I closed deals that even my father had thought impossible. He gave me more and more responsibility, formally nomming me Chief Operating Officer, his heir apparent in title as well as in fact. The business world buzzed with talk of the new, formidable Amelia Hale. I had everything I had ever worked for. My name was synonymous with power. At home, we maintained the facade. We attended the requisite galas and charity balls, a perfect trinity of wealth and influence. My mother was always at my father's side, elegant and poised, a ghost in Chanel, her smile never quite reaching her haunted eyes. We never spoke of Isabella. Her name was erased from our history, her photographs quietly removed from the walls and silver frames. It was as if she had never existed. I heard whispers of her fate through the grapevine, snippets of gossip passed along by friends who took a morbid pleasure in the drama. Isabella and Ethan had not, it turned out, been able to build a life on their grand, passionate love. Reality had hit them hard and fast. Without my father's money or name to support her, Isabella's charm wore thin. Ethan, ostracized from our social and professional circles and facing a bleak future, had quickly grown resentful of the pregnant, penniless woman he was saddled with. The last I heard, they had broken up in a bitter, screaming match in the lobby of the cheap motel they'd been living in. Ethan had simply walked away, vanishing from her life as easily as he had entered it. Isabella, alone and with no one to turn to, had eventually contacted some distant relatives of her biological father, David, and had gone to live with them in some small, forgotten town in the Midwest. She had traded a life of penthouses and privilege for one of obscurity and shame. She had her consequences. The thought brought me no satisfaction, only a dull, hollow ache. One evening, about a year after the engagement party, I was working late in my father's study. I was now the one who sat behind the imposing mahogany desk. He had been spending more time at our country estate, leaving the day-to-day running of the empire to me. I was reviewing a contract when I came across a file I hadn't seen before. It was old, tucked away in a back drawer. My curiosity piqued. I opened it. Inside were home videos, old VHS tapes from when Isabella and I were children. I found the old player in a cabinet, and with trembling hands, I put one in. The screen flickered to life, showing a scene from a long-ago Christmas morning. Two little girls in matching red velvet dresses were tearing open presents under a giant, glittering tree. A younger, happier version of my father was behind the camera, his laughter booming as a 5-year-old Isabella held up a doll, her face alight with pure, unadulterated joy. A 4-year-old me sat beside her, looking on with a serious expression before breaking into a wide, gap-toothed smile and holding up my own toy. I watched as my father in the video panned the camera to my mother, who was beaming, looking utterly content. He then turned the camera on himself, his arm around both of us girls, pulling us into a hug. "My beautiful girls," his younger voice said, full of a pride and love that felt so real, so undeniable. "My two perfect daughters." A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped my eye and traced a path down my cheek. It was the first tear I had shed since that terrible night. I watched the video of a family that had once been happy, a family that had once been whole, even if it was based on a lie. It was a lie, but it had been a happy one. In my quest for justice, for what was rightfully mine, I had demanded the truth. And the truth had set none of us free. It had been a poison that had corroded us from the inside out, leaving behind only power, money, and secrets. I had won the war, but in doing so, I had salted the earth of my own life. I was Amelia Hale, the undisputed heir to the Hale Empire. I had a kingdom of glass and steel, a vault of wealth, and a name that commanded respect and fear. I had everything a person could possibly want. And as I sat alone in the dark, silent study, the ghostly laughter of a little girl echoing from the screen, I had never in my entire life felt so profoundly, utterly, and irrevocably alone. The crown was mine, but it was colder and heavier than I could ever have imagined. And the price of wearing it was the one thing I could never get back. A sister's love, a father's warmth, a mother's joy, and the naive, trusting heart of the girl I used to be.